How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AITA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Hannah Whitaker arrived at the cemetery each morning just before 8, when the gates were still quiet and the air carried the faint smell of damp grass and old stone. The cemetery sat on the edge of Des Moines, bordered by narrow roads and modest houses, a place most people passed without looking twice. For Hannah, it had become the center of her working life, and, in ways she never spoke about, the anchor of her endurance. She worked steadily, without rush and without complaint. Her hands moved with practiced care as she repainted rusted metal fences, swept leaves from headstones, and cleared weeds from plots that had not been visited in years. Some graves bore fresh flowers and polished marble. Others were sunken, forgotten, their names barely legible. Hannah treated them all the same. She cleaned each marker as if someone would arrive at any moment to kneel beside it. Among her co-workers, she was known as quiet but reliable. She did not gossip, did not linger during breaks, and never refused a task, even when it meant staying late. There was something in the way she worked that made others lower their voices around her, as if the calm she carried demanded respect. No one needed to remind Hannah what to do. She noticed what was neglected and handled it before anyone asked. The only person who spoke to her freely was Samuel Brooks, the cemetery's elderly caretaker. He had worked there for decades and knew every path, every old tree, every unmarked corner where history had faded. He treated Hannah with a gentle familiarity, the kind reserved for family rather than co-workers. He often checked on her in the mornings, offering quiet remarks about the weather or reminding her to take a break when the work grew heavy. To Samuel, Hannah was like a daughter he never had. He noticed how she never rushed through her tasks, how she paused to straighten a crooked photo or brush dirt from a name. He never questioned why she arrived earlier than required or why she often worked in the same section before moving on to her assigned duties. Some things he understood did not need to be asked. Each morning, before beginning the day's work, Hannah walked to one particular grave near the eastern edge of the grounds. It was not the newest, nor the most elaborate. The headstone was modest, the engraving simple and clean. She would stand there for a moment, sometimes only a few seconds, sometimes longer, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady. She did not speak aloud. She did not kneel. There were no dramatic gestures. If someone had been watching, they might have thought she was simply checking the condition of the stone, the way she did with so many others. But this grave was different. It was the only one she visited every single day, without exception. The name etched into the stone was Lucas Whitaker. Lucas had been her fiancé. 5 years earlier, he had died in a car accident that ended in fire, the kind of tragedy people spoke about briefly before moving on. For Hannah, time had not softened the edges of that loss. It had only taught her how to carry it quietly. She did not tell her co-workers who Lucas had been. Most assumed he was a relative. Hannah never corrected them. The truth was not something she felt the need to explain. It lived in the small habits she carried, the way her shoulders tightened when she passed certain headstones, the way her eyes lingered on dates carved into stone. After her brief pause at Lucas's grave, Hannah would straighten, take a slow breath, and begin her workday. She did not cry. She did not pray. She simply continued. Loneliness had become familiar to her, but it had not made her bitter. Endurance had shaped her into someone steady, someone who survived without demanding attention for it. In the quiet of the cemetery, surrounded by those who could no longer speak, Hannah Whitaker found a place where her own silence made sense. And so, each morning, among the graves, she kept going. Long before Hannah Whitaker learned how to move quietly among the graves, she learned how to live without expecting permanence. She grew up in foster homes and temporary placements, places where nothing truly belonged to her and where attachments were treated with caution. By the time she reached adulthood, she understood that stability was something earned through effort, not promised by circumstance. When she aged out of the system, Hannah took whatever work she could find. She cleaned offices at night, stocked shelves early in the morning, and eventually found a job at a small cafe near downtown Des Moines. The pay was modest, the hours long, but the routine gave her something she valued: independence. She learned to manage on little, to stretch each paycheck, and to keep her expectations grounded in reality. It was at that cafe that she met Lucas Whitaker. He did not arrive with the air of someone seeking attention. He sat quietly, ordered the same drink each time, and thanked her by name. At first, Hannah barely noticed him beyond the familiarity of his presence. But Lucas noticed her. He noticed how she listened when customers spoke, how she never rushed them even during the busiest hours, how her smile was restrained but genuine. Over time, brief exchanges turned into longer conversations. Lucas asked about her day. Hannah asked about his work. He spoke carefully, rarely mentioning his background. When she eventually learned that he came from a wealthy and respected family in the area, she was surprised, not impressed, but unsettled. It created a distance she had not anticipated. Lucas, however, seemed indifferent to that distance. He spoke openly about his admiration for her honesty, her resilience, the way she carried herself without bitterness. Hannah, unused to being chosen without conditions, found herself slowly trusting the warmth in his attention. Their relationship grew not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Shared meals after late shifts, quiet walks, conversations that stretched late into the night. When Lucas told his parents about Hannah, the shift was immediate. Margaret Whitaker made her disapproval known without raising her voice. She asked polite questions that carried judgment beneath them, questions about Hannah's education, her family, her future plans. Thomas Whitaker was quieter, but no less distant. His silence a form of agreement. They spoke often about reputation, about expectations, about what was appropriate for their son. They never said Hannah was unworthy. They did not need to. Their disappointment was delivered through concern, framed as guidance. Margaret reminded Lucas of his responsibilities, of the image he was expected to maintain. She suggested introductions to other women, women whose backgrounds matched his own. Each comment was subtle, carefully worded, but persistent. Lucas found himself caught between two worlds. He loved Hannah for who she was, yet he had been raised to respect his parents' authority and judgment. At times, he withdrew into himself after visiting them, his mood shifting without explanation. Hannah noticed these changes, but did not press him. She understood pressure, even if she did not fully understand its source. When Lucas admitted that his parents opposed their relationship, Hannah did not argue. She did not demand loyalty or issue ultimatums. Instead, she listened, absorbing the reality with quiet disappointment. She believed that time could soften resistance. That sincerity might eventually outweigh prejudice. She had seen people change before, slowly, reluctantly, but still change. Lucas wanted to believe the same. He assured her that his parents would come around, that once they saw her character rather than her circumstances, their concerns would fade. Hannah chose to trust him. Love, to her, had always been a risk. This was simply another one. Yet beneath her hope lived an unspoken fear. She had learned early that some doors remained closed no matter how patiently one waited. Still, she stayed. She believed in what they had built together, fragile though it sometimes felt. In those early days, Hannah could not have imagined how quickly hope could be undone, or how deeply the consequences of divided loyalty would reach. What she knew was only this: she loved Lucas Whitaker, and she believed that love, given time, would be enough. It was a belief that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The silence began without warning. Lucas Whitaker stopped answering Hannah's calls late one evening, after a brief message saying he needed time to think. At first, she assumed exhaustion or another tense conversation with his parents. She sent one message, then another, careful not to sound anxious. Hours passed. Her phone remained still on the table beside her bed. By morning, worry had settled into something heavier. Hannah tried again, straight to voicemail. She told herself there were reasonable explanations. Meetings that ran late, a drained battery, a forgotten charger. She went to work, moved through her shift at the cafe on instinct alone, checking her phone whenever she could. The screen stayed dark. It was not Lucas's parents who called her. That evening, a mutual acquaintance reached her instead, hesitant and unsure how to begin. The words came out in fragments: an accident, a highway outside the city, a car engulfed in flames. Hannah struggled to understand what she was hearing. The details felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Lucas Whitaker was dead. The car had collided with another vehicle. There had been a fire. The driver had not survived. By the time emergency responders arrived, there was nothing to be done. Hannah sat down on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall. She waited for grief to arrive loudly, the way people described it. Instead, there was only a numb pressure behind her eyes, a sensation of falling without movement. She waited for Lucas's parents to call. They never did. Hours later, unable to endure the uncertainty, Hannah dialed Margaret Whitaker's number herself. The line connected quickly, as if Margaret had been waiting for the call. There was no greeting, no pause for sympathy. Margaret's voice was sharp, controlled, and unforgiving. She accused Hannah of distracting Lucas, of filling his head with unrealistic hopes, of pulling him away from the life he was meant to have. She spoke as though the accident were a direct consequence of Hannah's existence. Thomas Whitaker said nothing in the background. His silence felt deliberate. Hannah tried to speak. She tried to ask questions about the accident, about arrangements, about whether she could come. Margaret cut her off. Lucas was gone, she said, and Hannah needed to accept that. Then the line went dead. The funeral was held 2 days later. Hannah attended alone. She wore a simple black coat and stood near the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not cry openly. She felt the weight of eyes on her, curious, judgmental, disapproving. Some whispers reached her ears. Others did not need to be heard to be understood. Margaret Whitaker noticed her immediately. She leaned toward Thomas and muttered something Hannah could not hear. Thomas did not respond. He kept his gaze forward, his expression closed. No one approached Hannah. No one offered condolences. She remained invisible and exposed at the same time. When the service ended, the casket was transported to the cemetery on the outskirts of Des Moines. Only close family followed. Hannah followed too. No one stopped her. At the graveside, as the casket was lowered into the ground, something inside her finally gave way. The cold air pressed against her lungs. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tilt. Her vision narrowed, the edges darkening as if the world were receding from her. She did not remember falling. When she came to, unfamiliar faces hovered above her. A paramedic asked her name, asked if she could hear him. Hannah answered weakly. Her body felt heavy, unresponsive. Someone mentioned stress, shock, dehydration. She was lifted onto a stretcher and taken to the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed, the cemetery faded from view. The loss settled fully only then, not as a scream, but as a crushing finality. Lucas was gone. There would be no more explanations, no chance to resolve the distance that had grown between them. Whatever had existed between love and obligation had ended without warning. For Hannah Whitaker, the night Lucas died marked the end of the life she had imagined, and the beginning of a grief she would carry alone. Hannah remained in the hospital overnight. The doctors attributed her collapse to severe emotional shock, dehydration, and exhaustion, conditions that often followed sudden loss. Blood tests were ordered as a precaution. She answered questions mechanically, her thoughts still fixed on the image of the grave closing over Lucas's name. The following morning, A physician returned with quiet seriousness in his voice. He explained that one of the test results required clarification. Hannah listened without focus until a single word reached her with startling force. Pregnant. For a moment, she did not understand. The word seemed detached from her reality, floating somewhere beyond grief. The doctor explained again, carefully, that the pregnancy was still early, a matter of weeks. Hannah stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The realization came slowly and then all at once. Lucas was gone, and yet something of him remained. Shock folded into grief, and grief into responsibility. Hannah felt no joy. Not yet. Only a deep, unsteady awareness that her life had just shifted again, irrevocably. She asked practical questions. What to expect, what to do next. Whether stress could harm the pregnancy. The doctor reassured her as best he could and discharged her later that day with instructions to rest. She went home alone. For several days, Hannah told no one. She moved through her small apartment carefully, as if any sudden motion might shatter what little balance she had left. Sleep came in fragments. Food tasted distant. The silence Lucas had left behind now carried a second presence, one she could not yet name. Margaret Whittaker found out anyway. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, her posture rigid, her expression controlled. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of shared loss. She spoke directly, efficiently, as if this were a matter of business rather than life. Margaret accused Hannah of irresponsibility, of exploiting tragedy, of attempting to bind herself permanently to a family that had already suffered enough. She insisted the pregnancy would only reopen wounds, complicate matters, invite gossip. Her voice remained calm, but the intent behind her words was unmistakable. She demanded that Hannah terminate the pregnancy. When Hannah did not respond immediately, Margaret placed an envelope on the table. Inside was money, more than Hannah had ever held at one time. Margaret framed it as assistance, as compensation, as a way to help Hannah move on. The implication was clear. Take the money, erase the child, disappear quietly. Hannah stood up. She did not shout. She did not plead. She told Margaret to leave and slid the envelope back across the table. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then gathered her things and left without another word. That was the last time she came. The months that followed were among the hardest of Hannah's life. Pregnancy weighed heavily on a body already worn thin by grief. Nausea lingered. Fatigue settled into her bones. She worked until she could no longer manage the physical strain, taking on small jobs when possible, accepting help only when it was offered without condition. Friends were few. Support was limited. There were nights when Hannah lay awake, calculating expenses, wondering how she would manage alone. But she never questioned her decision. The child growing inside her was not a mistake. It was not leverage. It was a responsibility she had chosen fully despite the cost. When the time came, labor was long and exhausting. Hannah endured it without complaint, gripping the edge of the hospital bed, focusing on each breath. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy just before dawn. The nurse placed him gently in her arms. Hannah named him Noah Whittaker. She did not use Lucas's name. It felt like a burden too heavy for a child to carry. Instead, she chose a name that spoke of survival, of beginning again after loss. As she held her son, Hannah felt something shift, not relief, not happiness exactly, but resolve. She had been abandoned, judged and dismissed. Yet here in her arms was a future she would protect without apology. She left the hospital days later with no fanfare, no flowers, no visitors, just her child and the quiet determination that had shaped her life since the beginning. Hannah Whittaker chose motherhood not as an act of defiance, but as an act of truth. And in doing so, she defined who she was without bitterness, without regret, and without asking permission from anyone. After Noah's birth, Hannah tried to return to the kind of work she had known before. Service jobs that promised quick cash and flexible shifts. The reality proved harsher than the listings suggested. Cafes and diners needed hands. But the hours were unpredictable, the pay inconsistent, and the environment often hostile. Customers crossed boundaries easily. Managers looked the other way. Hannah learned to keep her head down, to refuse politely, to leave early when she could. It did not take long for exhaustion to overtake necessity. There were days when Hannah returned home drained, her body aching, her patience worn thin. She worried about childcare, about missing shifts when Noah was sick, about the unspoken cost of saying no too often. Safety mattered now in a way it never had before, not only her own, but her son's. She needed work that allowed her to breathe, to plan, to exist without constant vigilance. The posting for the cemetery appeared almost by accident. It offered modest pay, flexible hours, and seasonal work maintaining grounds and headstones. The duties were physical, but predictable. The location was quiet. Hannah hesitated only briefly. When she realized which cemetery it was, the irony did not escape her. Lucas was buried there. The place she had avoided in her grief would now become part of her daily life. She accepted the position. From the beginning, the work suited her. The pace was steady. The expectations were clear. There were no crowds, no demands for forced smiles. The silence felt honest. Hannah moved through the grounds with care, learning the layout, memorizing the paths, understanding which sections required more attention than others. It was there that she grew closer to Samuel Brooks. Samuel noticed her almost immediately, not because she stood out, but because she worked as if the place mattered to her personally. He offered guidance without instruction, showed her where tools were kept, warned her about uneven ground near older plots. Over time, their conversations lengthened. He asked about Noah. He remembered details. He never pressed her for explanations she did not volunteer. Samuel's wife, Evelyn, welcomed Hannah with equal warmth. She brought small gestures of kindness, leftover food, a knitted hat for Noah, quiet encouragement offered without intrusion. Together, the couple created a sense of belonging Hannah had not known in years. They did not replace what she had lost, but they steadied her. The cemetery became more than a workplace. It became a refuge. Hannah learned to appreciate the rhythm of the seasons there, the way autumn leaves collected in corners, the way winter snow softened even the harshest lines, the way spring returned color to ground long thought barren. Caring for neglected graves felt purposeful. The work asked for attention, not explanation. Each day, she continued her habit of visiting Lucas's grave before beginning her tasks. She did it early before others arrived, before the cemetery stirred fully awake. She stood quietly, straightened what needed straightening, and moved on. The ritual grounded her. Occasionally, Lucas's parents came. Hannah learned their schedule without intending to. Expensive cars arriving mid-morning. Short visits. Margaret always dressed impeccably, her posture unchanged, her expression distant. Thomas remained a step behind, quieter, his gaze fixed on the stone rather than the surroundings. Hannah avoided them deliberately. If she saw their car at the gate, she took her break elsewhere or shifted her tasks to another section. She did not want confrontation. She did not want acknowledgement. The past had settled into a shape she could manage, and she refused to disturb it. Samuel noticed. He never questioned her directly, but he adjusted assignments when needed. He understood enough to help without forcing conversation. In his eyes, Hannah was someone carrying weight without complaint. That was reason enough. Over time, Hannah settled into endurance. The cemetery gave her structure. Samuel and Evelyn gave her quiet support. Noah grew, safe and cared for. Life narrowed into manageable pieces. What Hannah did not know, what no one yet understood, was that the ground she tended so carefully still held unanswered questions. The refuge, she had chosen was quietly preparing to return something she had long believed buried. And when it did, endurance would no longer be enough. Hannah noticed the flowers one morning while clearing debris from a nearby plot. At first, she assumed they had been left by Lucas's parents. That would have been the reasonable explanation. They visited occasionally, always briefly, never speaking to anyone, leaving behind expensive arrangements that looked untouched by the weather. But these flowers were different. They were cheap, the kind sold in plastic sleeves at grocery stores. Their stems were unevenly trimmed, the wrapping creased and dull. Beside them sat a small bag of candy, individually wrapped pieces, faded from sun exposure. It was an odd offering, out of place among the polished headstones and manicured grass. Hannah stood still, unsettled. She removed the wilted petals carefully as she always did, but left the items where they were. The next day they were gone. The day after that they were back again, new flowers, the same kind, and another bag of candy. The pattern continued. After the third occurrence, Hannah mentioned it to Samuel Brooks in passing. She kept her tone neutral, as if it were only a question of maintenance. Samuel frowned slightly, thinking it over. "They're recent," he said after a moment, "and they're not from the Whitakers. Those two never leave anything like that." That answer stayed with her. Over the following days, Hannah became more attentive. She noted the timing, the condition of the offerings, the way they appeared without warning. Always early, always modest, always placed neatly at the base of Lucas's headstone. Other co-workers noticed too. Someone mentioned seeing a man near the eastern edge of the grounds, late in the evening. Another spoke of a figure lingering after hours, never causing trouble, never approaching anyone. The word homeless surfaced quietly, passed between them without certainty. Hannah listened without commenting. The idea unsettled her more than she expected. She told herself there were many explanations. People left offerings for strangers. Grief took unfamiliar forms. The cemetery drew all kinds of visitors, not all of them predictable. Still, something about the situation refused to settle. It was not fear that troubled her. It was the sense of something unfinished, as if a question had been left unanswered and was now insisting on being heard. She found herself watching Lucas's grave more closely, arriving earlier, lingering longer. One morning, she noticed footprints in the damp soil nearby, fresh, leading away toward the back of the grounds. They were gone by afternoon, erased by maintenance and time, but the impression remained. That night, Hannah barely slept. The cemetery had always been a place of stillness, a space where the past rested quietly. Now it felt altered, disturbed in a way she could not name. She thought of Lucas's name carved into stone, of the finality she had accepted for years. The flowers suggested something else, presence, intention, memory that refused to fade. By the end of the week, Hannah made a decision. She asked a co-worker to swap shifts so she could arrive earlier than usual. She told Samuel she wanted to check on a fence near the eastern section at dawn. He looked at her carefully, then nodded without question. On the morning she chose, Hannah entered the cemetery while the light was still low and the air cool. She moved quietly, avoiding the gravel paths, keeping to the edges where shadows lingered. Her heart beat steadily, not from panic, but from resolve. She stopped a short distance from Lucas's grave and waited. Whatever was bringing those flowers did not belong to routine or chance. It belonged to something unresolved, something that had survived despite being buried. Hannah Whitaker was done pretending not to notice. If someone was coming to Lucas's grave, she intended to find out who and why. Hannah did not come alone that morning. She arrived before sunrise with a co-worker she trusted, someone who had listened quietly to her concerns without dismissing them. They kept their distance, standing near a line of trees that bordered the eastern section of the cemetery. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint sound of traffic from a distant road. Dew clung to the grass, darkening the soil beneath their shoes. They waited. Time moved slowly in the half-light. Hannah focused on her breathing, on the familiar outline of the headstones ahead. Lucas's grave stood exactly where it always had, unchanged, silent. She told herself this was caution, nothing more. Curiosity sharpened by responsibility. Still, her pulse refused to steady. Footsteps broke the quiet. A figure emerged from the far path, moving hesitantly as if uncertain where to go. He was thin, his clothes worn and mismatched, layers pulled too tightly against the cold. His hair was unkempt, his posture slightly bent. At first glance, he was exactly what her coworkers had described, a homeless man, out of place and overlooked. He stopped at Lucas's grave. Hannah felt the shift immediately. The man stood there for a long moment, staring down at the headstone. Then, slowly he knelt. His movements were careful, almost reverent. He reached into a plastic bag and removed a small bouquet of flowers, inexpensive and already beginning to wilt. He placed them neatly at the base of the stone, adjusting them until they were straight. Hannah's breath caught. It was not the act itself that unsettled her. It was the way he did it, the familiarity, the quiet concentration, the subtle pause before his hand rested briefly against a stone. The gesture felt intimate, personal in a way that went beyond coincidence. When the man spoke, his voice was low, barely audible. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words carried by the still air. "I didn't forget." The sound struck Hannah like a blow. The tone, the cadence, the hesitation before each word. Something in it pulled at a memory she had sealed away. She stepped forward without realizing it. A twig snapped under her foot. The man turned sharply. For a moment, they simply stared at one another. His eyes widened, not with recognition, but with fear, as if he expected to be chased away. He stood quickly, clutching the plastic bag to his chest. "I didn't mean any trouble," he said, backing away. "I'll go." Hannah raised her hands instinctively, her voice unsteady. She told him he wasn't in trouble, that he didn't have to leave. Her words felt distant to her own ears. Up close, the familiarity grew impossible to ignore. His voice, the angle of his jaw, the way he held himself when he was uncertain. Each detail collided with memory, forcing it to the surface. Hannah struggled to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be true. Lucas was dead. The man shook his head when she asked his name. He said he didn't know it. He said he woke up years ago injured and confused, with nothing but fragments, faces without names, places without context. He said the cemetery felt familiar, that this grave felt important, though he could not explain why. Hannah listened, her heart pounding. As he spoke, he shifted his weight, pulling his jacket closer around his shoulders. The movement exposed a patch of skin near his collarbone. Hannah froze. There, unmistakable even in the dim light, was a small, distinct birthmark. She had traced it countless times with her fingers in another life. It was the same shape, the same place, identical. Her vision blurred. The world seemed to narrow to that single detail, overwhelming everything else. Her mind rejected the conclusion even as her body reacted to it. Fear surged, tangled with disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. The man noticed her staring and followed her gaze. He tugged the fabric back into place, confused, wary. "What is it?" he asked. Hannah could not answer. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. The certainty she had built her life upon began to fracture, piece by piece. This was impossible, and yet, standing before her was evidence she could not dismiss. Grief, long dormant, stirred violently. Doubt fought against memory. The dead were not supposed to return. And yet, as the man stood there, frightened and unfamiliar, Hannah Whitaker felt the past pressing forward, demanding to be seen. Nothing about this moment fit the story she had been living. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Hannah led the man to a bench beneath an old maple tree, far enough from the main paths that they would not be interrupted. The morning light had strengthened, pulling color from the grass and revealing the lines of exhaustion on his face. He sat stiffly, hands folded, as if afraid that any sudden movement might end the moment. Hannah took out her phone. She hesitated only briefly before opening a folder she had not touched in years. Photographs appeared on the screen, unremarkable at first glance, then devastating in their familiarity. Lucas smiling at a cafe table. Lucas standing by a river, sleeves rolled up. Lucas half asleep on a couch, his hair falling into his eyes. She held the phone out to him. The man leaned closer, cautious, then froze. His breathing changed. His fingers trembled as he took the device from her hands, staring at the images with growing intensity. His brow furrowed, confusion tightening into something sharper. "I know this," he said slowly. "I don't know how, but I know it." Hannah stayed silent. The man pressed the phone to his chest, as if anchoring himself. Fragments began to surface, sensations before words. A raised voice, a shove, the smell of gasoline. He remembered anger, not his own but directed at him, and a confrontation that had escalated too quickly to stop. He remembered being hit. Not a crash, not fire, violence. The memory came in pieces. Someone had followed him after an argument. There had been a blow to the head, sudden and disorienting. Pain, then darkness. When he woke, it was days later, alone, injured, unable to recall his name or where he belonged. He remembered wandering, sleeping wherever he could, learning to survive without answers. Hannah listened, her hands clenched in her lap. The truth assembled itself with cruel clarity. The car accident had happened, but not with Lucas inside it. Someone else had taken his vehicle. Someone else had died in the fire. The remains had been burned beyond recognition. And the family, eager for closure, had accepted the conclusion without question. Lucas had survived. Barely. The man's memories sharpened as Hannah filled in the gaps. Dates, places, names. Each detail unlocked another piece. The name Lucas Whitaker landed heavily between them. He repeated it under his breath, as if testing its weight. "Yes," he said finally, a tremor in his voice. "That's my name." What followed was not an embrace. They sat side by side, close enough to feel the other's presence, yet separated by 5 years of loss that could not be erased by proximity alone. Hannah's chest ached with the effort of holding herself still. Lucas stared at the ground, breathing unevenly, the truth pressing down on him from every direction. The world had moved on without him. Hannah told him about the funeral, about the hospital, about the years that followed. She spoke carefully, aware that each word carried consequences. When she reached the part she had rehearsed silently for days, her voice faltered. She told him about Noah. Lucas looked up sharply. At first he did not understand. Then comprehension struck, swift and devastating. His hands covered his face. A sound escaped him that Hannah had never heard before. Not grief, not relief, but something raw and unguarded. "I have a son," he said. Hannah nodded. The knowledge overwhelmed him. He asked questions he could barely finish. How old? Was he healthy? Did he know anything about his father? Hannah answered steadily, grounding him where she could. She did not promise what she could not deliver. She did not soften the truth. Lucas cried then, quietly, shoulders shaking, as if ashamed of the release. Hannah remained beside him, her presence a steady point in a moment that threatened to fracture completely. They stayed there for a long time. Eventually, Lucas spoke again. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He said he did not know how to return to a life that had already buried him. He feared facing his parents, feared the damage done by absence and silence. Hannah listened. She told him that survival was not betrayal, that memory loss had stolen his choices, not his character. She did not absolve him of everything, but she did not condemn him either. This was not a reunion built on certainty. It was built on fragile truth. As the morning wore on, the cemetery stirred with distant movement. Hannah knew they could not remain hidden forever. Decisions would have to be made. Explanations would follow. The world would demand its answers. But for this moment, there was only the reality before them. Lucas Whittaker was alive. The accident that had taken everything from Hannah had never taken him at all. It had merely buried him beneath misunderstanding, negligence, and time. And now, standing on the edge of what had been lost, both of them faced a truth that changed everything. Nothing could return the years that were gone, but the dead had returned, and with him came consequences that could no longer be avoided. Lucas did not return to his parents' home immediately. He needed time to let the truth settle, to understand the shape of a life that had continued without him, and to prepare himself for what could not be undone. When he finally agreed to see them, it was not out of longing, but necessity. Some truths could not remain unspoken. The meeting took place in the living room. Lucas remembered well, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. The furniture was the same. The air carried the same controlled quiet. Margaret Whittaker sat upright on the sofa, composed, alert. Thomas Whittaker stood near the window, his back partially turned, as if distance alone could shield him. Margaret spoke first. She froze mid-sentence. Lucas stood in the doorway, thinner than before, his posture altered by years of survival, but unmistakable. For a brief moment, the room held nothing but silence. Margaret's composure faltered. Her face drained of color. Thomas turned slowly. Neither of them moved. Lucas stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse them immediately. He simply stood there, alive, forcing them to face what they had accepted without question. Margaret recovered quickly. She reached for explanations, confusion, shock, disbelief. She spoke of grief, of trauma, of mistakes made in the chaos following the accident. She asked where he had been, why he had not come home sooner. Lucas listened. Then he spoke. He described waking up injured and alone. He described the years without memory, without name, without support. He described returning to a world that had already mourned him and moved on. His words were measured, precise, leaving no space for interruption. He asked them why no one had insisted on identifying the body. Margaret deflected at first. She blamed authorities. She blamed the condition of the remains. She blamed the urgency to close the chapter. Lucas did not accept it. He reminded them that resources had never been a problem for their family, that questions could have been asked, that answers could have been demanded. Thomas said nothing. Lucas then spoke of Hannah. Margaret's expression hardened. Lucas exposed the truth calmly without dramatics. He spoke of Hannah being excluded, blamed, and erased, of her being denied information, denied respect, denied acknowledgement. He revealed the pregnancy Margaret had tried to silence with money. The room shifted. Margaret's attempts to justify herself faltered under the weight of detail. She claimed she had been protecting her son's memory. Lucas corrected her. She had been protecting control. Margaret's arguments unraveled. Each explanation contradicted the last. Each defense revealed what had truly motivated her: fear of shame, fear of loss of influence, fear of Hannah's presence disrupting the narrative she preferred. Lucas did not shout. He did not insult her. That restraint carried more weight than anger ever could. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low. He admitted they had not wanted complications. They had wanted closure. Hannah, and later the child, had represented uncertainty they did not want to face. Lucas absorbed the words in silence. When he responded, it was not with rage, but with finality. He said he did not hate them. He said he understood fear. But understanding did not mean forgiveness without consequence. What they had done, what they had chosen not to do, had shaped years of suffering for others. Forgiveness, he told them, would be conditional. He would not allow them to rewrite the past. He would not allow them to minimize Hannah's endurance or deny Noah's existence. There would be no private arrangements, no quiet erasures. If they wished to remain part of his life, it would be on terms defined by honesty. Lucas made his decision clear. He would live independently. He would not return to the expectations or control that had once governed his choices. He would build a life based on responsibility, not reputation. Before leaving, Lucas spoke one final truth. Hannah Whitaker was his partner. Noah Whitaker was his son. He would no longer allow either of them to be hidden. The acknowledgement was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no witnesses gathered in the room. Yet its impact was unmistakable. The power Margaret had relied on, silence, influence, control, collapsed under the weight of simple truth. Lucas left without waiting for permission. News traveled quickly, as it always did. In quiet conversations and measured confirmations, the truth emerged. The man presumed dead had returned. The woman once dismissed had endured. The child once denied now existed beyond denial. For Hannah, there was no triumph in it, no satisfaction drawn from seeing others humbled. The justice that arrived did so quietly, without spectacle, but it arrived nonetheless. What had been buried was no longer hidden, and for the first time since the night Lucas disappeared, the balance of truth had been restored, not through revenge, but through accountability that could no longer be avoided. Nothing returned to normal after Lucas came back, and Hannah did not want it to. What followed was not a sudden reunion, filled with promises or dramatic declarations, but something quieter and far more difficult, learning how to trust time again. Hannah and Lucas rebuilt their relationship, slowly, deliberately, aware that love interrupted by grief did not simply resume where it had stopped. They talked, often, about the years that had been stolen, about the misunderstandings that had hardened into silence, about the people they had become while living separate lives shaped by survival rather than choice. Lucas listened more than he spoke, especially when Hannah described the loneliness of raising Noah without certainty, without support, without the right to grieve openly. He never asked her why she endured. He thanked her for doing so. Noah's adjustment came in stages. At first, he studied Lucas from a distance, curious, cautious, protective of the world he knew. Lucas did not push. He knelt to Noah's height, spoke gently, showed up consistently. He learned bedtime routines. He learned favorite foods. He learned when to step back and when to stay. Trust did not arrive all at once. It grew. Hannah watched this bond form with a mixture of relief and restraint. She did not romanticize it. She understood that fatherhood was not a title earned by return, but a role proven by presence. Lucas seemed to understand that instinctively. He never competed with Hannah's strength. He complemented it. As life stabilized, practical decisions followed. Hannah left the cemetery, not because she rejected what it had given her, but because she no longer needed to survive in silence. Lucas offered her stable work within his business, not as a favor, but as recognition of her competence. Hannah accepted only after clear boundaries were established. She would not trade independence for comfort. Lucas respected that. Still, the cemetery remained part of their lives. Hannah continued visiting Samuel Brooks and his wife, Evelyn. The elderly couple had been witnesses to her quiet endurance when no one else had been watching. They had offered food without questions, protection without judgment, care without expectation. Gratitude, Hannah believed, was not something owed only to blood. Samuel, in his understated way, accepted Lucas with cautious approval. He did not demand explanations or apologies. He measured Lucas by how he treated Hannah and Noah. When that standard was met, Samuel welcomed him, not as a savior, but as a man learning responsibility. Evelyn embraced Noah fully. In her presence, the child found stability unconnected to circumstance or name. Hannah often reflected on those years, on who remained when she had nothing to offer but exhaustion. The answer never included wealth or status. It included people who stayed, who listened, who helped quietly and left no record of it. That understanding reshaped how Hannah defined family. Lucas's parents remained at a distance, respectful, careful, boundaries held. There were no grand reconciliations, no illusions of restored authority. What existed instead was something simpler and more honest. Accountability without erasure. Hannah did not seek their approval. She no longer needed it. What mattered had already been proven. As life settled into a rhythm shaped by choice rather than fear, Hannah recognized something she had once believed impossible: peace without forgetting. Lucas's return did not undo loss. It did not erase grief. It transformed it into something bearable, something grounded in truth. She understood now that survival had never been her weakness. It had been her strength. Love, she learned, was not proven by bloodlines or inheritance. It was proven by responsibility, by who stayed when it was inconvenient, who acted when no one was watching, who chose presence over pride. And truth, Hannah knew, did not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it took years. Sometimes it arrived quietly, at a grave no one thought to question. But it did return, not to restore what was lost, but to reveal what remained. And what remained in the end was not bitterness, not vengeance, not silence. It was dignity,